Forget dark museums. This is a cathedral where the decoration isn't gold or marbleite the bones of millions of human beings. Skulls line the walls, femurs build the arches, and chandeliers made of spines hang above the altar. This isn't fiction or horror, it's real, and it's beautiful in a way that makes you deeply uncomfortable. This isn't just history at S, a brutal art form that forces you to confront your own mortality. Welcome to the Ossuaries of Europe. Before we begin, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze. It helps keep these haunting corners of history alive, one strange story at a time. The Ossuaries of Europe began not as art, but as necessity. In medieval cities, death was a constant companion war. Plague, famine, and poverty filled cemeteries faster than the earth could take them. Churches faced a simple, terrifying problem. There was no more room to bury the dead. So the living did something both practical and profound. They built with bones. They exhumed the remains of those long buried and moved them into crypts beneath the churches or chapels. But they didn't just stack the bones in piles. They arranged them. They made patterns, symbols, and decorations out of the remains. What started as storage became design. What began as grim necessity evolved into a form of sacred architecture, one that didn't hide death, but made it part of the structure itself. To stand inside an ossuary is to stand inside a paradox. It's both sacred and unsettling. The walls breathe history. Each skull belonged to a person, a farmer, a monk, a soldier, a mother, and yet together they lose individuality. They become material, pattern, texture. In life, they were separate. In death, they are one. The most famous of these ossuaries sits just outside Prague, in the small Czech town of Sedlec. The Sedlec ossuary, also known as the Bone Church, holds the remains of an estimated 40,000 people. Step inside, and you're met not by stone carvings or paintings, but by bones. The chandelier hanging in the center is said to contain at least one of every bone in the human body. Skulls form garlands across the walls. Pyramids of femurs rise beside the pews. The Schwarzenberg family crest on the wall is rendered entirely in bone, meticulously shaped to depict a raven pecking out the eye socket of a skull. Every piece in Sedlec tells a story, not of death alone, but of reverence. The monks who built it in the 14th century believed they were creating a place of equality. In the ossuary, a king and a beggar rest side by side, their bones indistinguishable. Death, the great leveler, had become literal architecture. The message wasn't despair, it was humility. The artistic impulse behind these spaces came later, often centuries after the bones were first placed. The monks and caretakers began arranging them into increasingly complex designs, perhaps to remind the faithful that death was not something to fear, but something to contemplate. This is what medieval Christianity called memento mori, remember, that you will die. But here, that message wasn't whispered in sermons or carved in stone, it was shouted in bone. And Sedlec was only one of many. Across Europe, ossuaries took shape in catacombs, crypts, and churches from Portugal to Poland. In Evora, Portugal, the Chapel of Bones carries a warning at its entrance. We bones that are here await yours. The interior is covered in skulls and tibias from more than 5,000 people. Between the columns of bone, the walls are engraved with religious verses about the fleeting nature of life. In France, the catacombs of Paris stretch for miles beneath the city, a subterranean labyrinth containing the remains of roughly 6 million Parisians. When the city's cemeteries overflowed in the 18th century, officials began transferring the bones into old limestone quarries. Over time, workers arranged them into elaborate geometric walls, rows upon rows of skulls and femurs stacked with eerie precision. Walking through them, you hear your footsteps echo off the stone and bone. The air is cool and still. The silence is heavy. The living move through the dead like ghosts. It's easy to see these places as morbid curiosities, but their purpose was more philosophical than grotesque. In a world without modern medicine or long life expectancy, death was an everyday fact. The ossuaries made that fact visible. They were built to remind you that your body, too, was temporary. The monks who tended these spaces saw no contradiction between beauty and death. For them, the arrangement of bones was a prayer, a meditation on the impermanence of flesh and the endurance of the soul. In modern eyes, though, these structures provoke discomfort. We come from a culture that hides death. We seal it away in hospitals and funeral homes, but the ossuaries refuse to look away. They confront you with the physical truth of what we all become. Every skull once smiled, spoke, ate, and dreamed. Now it decorates a wall. And strangely, in that confrontation, there's a kind of peace. Imagine standing inside Sedlik, or Evora, the light from stained glass falling across the ivory white bones. The silence feels alive. The air smells of dust and candle wax. It's not horror, you feel it. Awe, you realize the builders weren't trying to frighten you. They were trying to make you remember. The bones aren't trophies, they're teachers. During the medieval and Renaissance periods, artists and clerics saw no clear line between faith and death. To them, mortality wasn't morbid. It was sacred knowledge. The bones were not reminders of decay, but of continuity. In a way, ossuaries turned death into art because they refused to let it vanish. The dead were not gone. They were still part of the church, still part of the community, still part of the story. It's hard to imagine building something like that today. We think of death as the end of the story, not part of the architecture of life. But in the medieval mind, the line between the two was thin. You could pray beneath a chandelier of skulls and not see contradiction. You could decorate with death and still call it holy. The ossuaries endure because they embody that tension, beauty, and brutality in the same breath. They are, in every sense, the art of what remains. In the crowded heart of medieval Europe, death was not distant. It was everywhere. The dead lay just beneath the feet of the living, separated by only a few inches of soil. Churchyards overflowed, bones surfaced after heavy rains, and the living world was constantly reminded of the quiet, growing pressure of the dead beneath them. The ossuaries that would later become hauntingly beautiful monuments of faith and mortality were not born out of morbid fascination, but out of necessity. Cities like Paris, Prague, and Rome faced an undeniable crisis. There was simply no more room for the dead. By the 12th and 13th centuries, population growth, urbanization, and outbreaks of disease had filled the cemeteries beyond capacity. In Paris, for example, the Cemetery of the Innocents had been in continuous use for nearly 1,000 years. Generations upon generations were buried there until the earth could hold no more. The stench of decay became unbearable. Residents complained that the air carried sickness from the rotting bodies. In some cases, mass graves were opened and rearranged to make room for new burials, disturbing old remains in the process. The dead were quite literally spilling into the streets. The church faced a dilemma. In Christian doctrine, the body was sacred, destined for resurrection at the end of time. Destroying remains, burning, or scattering them was considered unacceptable. Yet the land was finite, and burial space was a resource that could no longer meet demand. The solution that emerged was practical, yet deeply spiritual: ossuaries. Instead of being discarded, bones would be preserved, cleaned, and stored in sacred places, often beneath the churches or within dedicated chapels. This practice began modestly. Early ossuaries were small crypts or charnel houses, where the bones of the long dead were stacked along the walls or arranged neatly in niches. But over time, these spaces evolved into complex works of sacred art temples, built from human remains that transformed necessity into something both reverent and haunting. The arrangement of bones was not random. Skulls, femurs, and ribs were organized with astonishing precision, forming crosses, chandeliers, coats of arms, and even full altarpieces. One of the most famous examples of this transformation is the Sedlik ossuary in the Czech Republic, also known as the Bone Church. Located beneath the Cemetery Church of All Saints, it holds the remains of an estimated 40,000 to 70,000 people. Its creation stemmed from the same Isu overcrowded burial grounds. In the 13th century, the abbot of Sedlik brought back a handful of soil from Golgotha, the hill where Christ was said to have been crucified, and sprinkled it across the cemetery grounds. This act made the site one of the most desired burial places in Central Europe. Over the next few centuries, thousands of people were laid to rest there, especially during the Black Death and the Hussite Wars. By the 16th century, the cemetery was overflowing. The bones were exhumed, cleaned, and stored in the crypt. But it wasn't until 1870 that a woodcarver named František Rint was hired to bring order to the chaos. His solution was both practical and artistic. He used the bones as his medium. The result was a space where faith and mortality intertwined in the most direct way imaginable. Skulls formed pyramids that seemed to reach for heaven. A chandelier made from every bone in the human body hung from the ceiling like a frozen symbol of the final unity of mankind. This was not just decoration, it was theology made visible. The arrangement of bones in these ossuaries reflected a Christian understanding of death as a temporary state. The skeleton was not a horror to be hidden, but a reminder that the body was only sleeping, awaiting resurrection. The bones themselves, arranged in patterns of symmetry and beauty, spoke of divine order. Even in death, there was structure, meaning, and purpose. In many ways, these ossuaries mirrored the medieval mindset toward mortality. Death was not something to be denied or feared, but integrated into daily life. People lived in close proximity to decay. The memento mori, reminder of death, was not confined to philosophy or art, but built directly into the architecture of their world. Walking through a bone chapel was not a morbid experience. It was an act of reflection. The visitor was surrounded by the physical reality of human mortality, yet also by a sense of transcendence. These bones had once walked, worked, and prayed in the same streets. Now they served as silent witnesses to the fleeting nature of existence and the endurance of faith. Beyond their spiritual meaning, ossuaries were also feats of engineering and organization. In Paris, the catacombs became perhaps the most famous example of this blend of necessity and artistry. By the late 18th century, the city's cemeteries were overflowing. The Cemetery of the Innocents had become so hazardous that nearby residents demanded its closure. In 1786, under the orders of King Louis XVI, the bones of over 6 million Parisians were relocated into the city's underground quarries. For years, carts rolled through the streets at night, covered in black cloth, carrying bones to their new resting place. The workers who arranged them underground could have simply dumped the remains in piles, but they didn't. They took care to line the walls with femurs and skulls, forming patterns and columns. Even in anonymity, there was dignity. The dead were not forgotten. They were given a new kind of monument. Each skull, each femur, was part of a vast mosaic that spoke of both the horror and the beauty of human mortality. The catacombs of Paris transformed the chaos of death into a quiet, orderly reflection of life's fragility. Other regions of Europe followed similar paths, though each culture expressed it differently. In Rome, the Capuchin crypt beneath Santa Maria della Concezione dei Cappuccini contains the bones of thousands of friars arranged into intricate designs. The message written at the entrance is stark, but deeply human. What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. It is both warning and comfort, a meditation on the shared fate of all living things. These ossuaries also reveal something profound about the psychology of the time. Modern people tend to separate life from death, to hide it away in hospitals, morgues, and cemeteries on the outskirts of cities. But medieval Europeans had no such luxury. Death was part of the fabric of life, visible, tangible, and unavoidable. The bone churches were a way to make peace with that fact, to weave mortality into the sacred order of existence. They turned decay into devotion, transforming overcrowding into awe. The Christian symbolism within these structures cannot be overstated. Every skull and femur was a reminder of the resurrection promised in Scripture. The faithful believed that these bones would one day rise again, reassembled by divine will. Preserving them, arranging them with care, was a sign of reverence, not fear. Even the macabre aesthetic served a moral purpose: to humble the living. The message was clear: no matter your wealth, status, or power, all end up as bones in the same ground. In the face of eternity, all men are equal. When viewed through this lens, the ossuaries of Europe were less about death and more about transformation. They represented a shift from individual memory to collective remembrance. The dead were no longer isolated in forgotten graves. They became part of a living artwork that spanned generations. Each skull was one among thousands, contributing to a larger pattern. In a society that valued community over individuality, this merging of remains mirrored their worldview perfectly. Today, visitors often describe these places as eerie or unsettling, but to those who built them, they were expressions of faith and order. They were the ultimate reconciliation between the physical and the spiritual, the temporary and the eternal. The people who walked among those bones centuries ago saw not horror, but harmony, the unity of all human beings in death, awaiting the same promise of rebirth. The ossuaries stand as one of Europe's most haunting and honest responses to a practical problem. Overcrowded cemeteries forced people to confront mortality head-on, but instead of turning away, they built something sacred from it. What began as a desperate solution to a space crisis became one of the most profound artistic and spiritual expressions of the medieval Minda world, where even the bones of the dead had meaning, beauty, and a place in the order of things. In the quiet town of Kutna Hora in the Czech Republic stands a small, unassuming chapel that looks like any other from the outside. But step inside, and you realize it's not made for the living. Every wall, every arch, every chandelier is built from the dead. This is the Sedlec Ossuary, the Bone Church, and it is one of the most hauntingly beautiful structures in Europe. Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze. It helps us keep exploring the forgotten, the macabre, and the strange beauty that lives on the edge of history. The Sedlec Ossuary holds the remains of an estimated 40,000 to 70,000 people. The bones of these thousands are not hidden or buried, they are artfully displayed, forming everything from wall decorations to furniture to a chandelier said to contain every bone in the human body. The effect is immediate and overwhelming. It's not just a room, it's a confrontation. You are surrounded by death, yet what you feel isn't fear. It's a strange calm, an acceptance that beauty and mortality can exist together. The story of Sedlec begins in the 13th century. The land where the chapel stands belonged to a Cistercian monastery. Around 1278, the abbot was sent to the Holy Land by the King of Bohemia. When he returned, he brought back a small jar of soil from Golgotha, the hill in Jerusalem, where Christ was crucified. He sprinkled that soil across the monastery cemetery, turning it into one of the most sacred burial grounds in Europe. Word spread quickly. Everyone wanted to be buried there. Nobles, peasants, monks all saw it as holy ground. For centuries, the dead poured in, but when the Black Death swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, followed by the Hussite Wars in the 15th century, the number of bodies overwhelmed the small graveyard. There simply wasn't space. So the monks began to dig up older graves to make room for new ones. The exhumed bones were stacked neatly in a chapel built specifically to house them. For centuries, they sat there in silence piled high, waiting for meaning. Then, in 1870, a local woodcarver named František Rindt was hired by the Schwarzenberg family, the chapel's patrons, to bring order to the chaos. What he created was something beyond order. It was art born from death itself. Rindt bleached every bone to a uniform, ghostly white, and arranged them into elaborate patterns that still define the chapel today. The first thing you notice when you enter is the chandelier. It hangs from the center of the nave like a suspended galaxy of bone skulls, femurs, vertebrae, and ribs, all spiraling together in perfect symmetry. It's said to contain at least one of every bone in the human body. The longer you look at it, the more impossible it seems. It's both grotesque and graceful, an object that should repel you but instead holds you in awe. Around the walls, garlands of skulls drape like ribbons. Pyramids of bones rise in the corners, stacked with mathematical precision. In the center of one wall, the Schwarzenberg family crest is rendered entirely from human remains. Skeletal raven pecking at the eye socket of a skull, framed by ribs and spines. Even the artist's signature, František Rindt, is spelled out in bone near the entrance, as if to remind you that creation and destruction are never far apart. The bones aren't random, they are deliberate. Rindt's arrangement transforms them into symbols of symmetry, of resurrection, of the fragile order that life builds against death. It's easy to forget that each skull once held a face, that each femur once walked through the world. Standing inside Sedlec, individuality dissolves. The dead have become part of something larger than themselves, something collective, almost eternal. The chapel doesn't glorify death, it normalizes it. It whispers the same message that medieval Europe preached through paintings, sculptures, and sermons. Memento mori, remember that you will die. But Sedlec doesn't just remind you of mortality, it envelops you in it. The bones aren't warning you from a distance, they're speaking directly to you, face to face. You can almost imagine the silence when Rindt worked there, the sound of bones clicking against each other, the cold air in the crypt, the strange intimacy of arranging skulls into patterns of turning decay into geometry. He wasn't desecrating the dead, he was giving them order, form, and purpose. In a world that treated death as divine inevitability, this was an act of devotion, not horror. Tourists who visit today often describe the Sedlec ossuary as eerie or surreal, but in its own time, it was seen as sacred craftsmanship. Death wasn't taboo, was part of life's cycle. The same people who prayed for eternal salvation in the chapel above also walked beneath it among the bones, acknowledging the final equality that all humans share. Kings and peasants, warriors and priests all stripped down to the same architecture. The beauty of Sedlec lies in its contradiction. It is both decoration and decay. It is sacred space and physical remains. It doesn't hide. What we fear it forces us to see it, to stand inside it, and to realize that the human body, even in death, can still be used to create meaning. Light filters through the narrow windows and reflects off the bleached white of the bones, filling the chapel with a soft, almost holy glow. The skulls don't leer, they watch. The bones don't threaten, they testify. Each one a fragment of a human story, long forgotten, now woven into a pattern that outlives the memory of any single person. What makes Sedlec unforgettable is how it transforms the grotesque into grace. You expect horror, but what you find instead is reverence. You expect a tomb, but you find a statement, a message that the material of death can still be shaped into beauty. The bones are not meant to frighten you. They are meant to remind you that you share the same fate. That the distance between the living and the dead is thinner than we like to believe. Even now, centuries later, the Sedlec ossuary stands as a living paradox. It's a church filled with death that somehow affirms life. It's a museum of mortality that feels strangely alive. People enter in silence, expecting fear, and leave quieter, as if the bones have whispered something ancient and personal. That the only thing more haunting than death is forgetting that it is inevitable. In medieval and early modern Europe, death was not an abstraction, it was a presence. It walked the streets during plague years, lingered in the churchyards after battles, and sat quietly beside the living during Mass. The ossuaries that filled Europe as churches and cathedrals were not built simply to solve a space problem. They became physical meditations on mortality. To step into one was to confront the unavoidable truths of existence, that every life, no matter how grand or obscure, ended in the same stillness. The Latin phrase memento mori, remember that you must die, was not a threat, it was a reminder to live with clarity, humility, and purpose. In a world without the medical illusions of control that define modern life, death was familiar. It was woven into the rhythm of the seasons, into the sermons, and into the very architecture of faith. The ossuary gave this familiarity a sacred shape. The bones were not hidden away, but displayed in deliberate patterns that forced visitors to face the inevitable end of all flesh. Each skull, empty and identical, stared back at the living as if asking a silent question. What will you do with the time you have left? In Prague's Sedlec ossuary, thousands of skulls and femurs form walls and arches that seem almost decorative at first glance. But the deeper one looks, the more it becomes a meditation on impermanence. The skulls that form the chandelier once belonged to people of every station: peasants, merchants, soldiers, and nobles, all reduced to the same pale matter. It is a democracy of death. The artist, František Rint, understood that this arrangement was not grotesque but honest. He bleached the bones to preserve them, ensuring they would remain clean and intact, a gesture of respect. The result is a space that feels both sacred and unsettling, a place where beauty and decay merge until they are inseparable. The idea behind memento mori was to humble the human spirit. Medieval people were constantly reminded that life was fragile and that pride was foolish. No matter one's achievements or possessions, all ended the same way. This concept was not meant to paralyze the living, but to liberate them from illusion. By acknowledging death, they were meant to live with greater intention. The wealthy patrons who funded the construction of ossuaries often did so not out of morbidity, but as acts of faith. They wished to rest among their fellow believers, equal in death, surrounded by reminders of their shared fate. In the Capuchin crypt in Rome, the message is even more explicit. The friars used the bones of their dead brothers to decorate the walls and ceilings of their burial chambers. Vertebrae form rosettes, skulls line arches, and skeletal arms appear to reach outward like ancient vines. Yet at the entrance, a simple inscription speaks louder than the art itself. What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. This was not morbid poetry, it was instruction. The monks lived daily with the sight of their own mortality, using it as a constant reminder to cultivate virtue and humility. To the modern eye, such displays may seem disturbing or even macabre, but within their original context, they were acts of devotion. Medieval Christianity held that death was not an end, but a passage. The body decayed, but the soul endured. The bones of the dead, then, were not gruesome relics, but sacred remains, physical evidence of the promise of resurrection. By surrounding themselves with these symbols, the faithful sought to keep their priorities in order, to resist vanity, greed, and moral decay. Death was not something to be feared. It was the ultimate equalizer and purifier. The ossuary was, in this sense, a mirror. The visitor who descended into a bone crypt confronted not horror, but recognition. Every skull was a version of their own. Every femur had once carried someone's weight through the same uncertain world. The lesson was universal. To remember death was to remember life's value. In an age of wars, famine, and disease, this reflection was not a choice, but a necessity. When mortality was so visible, people sought meaning in its presence, not escape from it. These spaces also reveal the medieval understanding of art and symbolism. The use of human bones as building material was not a statement of disregard, but of transformation. The dead were given a new role to teach, to remind, to inspire contemplation. Their remains became part of something enduring. The patterns of bones in the Sedlec ossuary or the Paris catacombs are not random, they are symmetrical, balanced, and ordered, echoing the divine geometry that medieval Christians believed reflected the structure of creation itself. In their stillness, the bones formed a kind of silent liturgy, expressing faith in the cyclical nature of life and death. The philosophical implications extended far beyond religion. The ossuaries also carried a social message. They stripped away the illusions of hierarchy. A king's skull looked no different from that of a beggar. A noblewoman's bones mingled with those of a soldier or a priest. In these chambers, the distinctions that ruled the living world dissolved completely. This equality in death reinforced the moral order preached from the pulpit, that all souls were equal before God. Consider the experience of walking into the catacombs of Paris in the late 18th century. After they were converted from disorganized tunnels of bones into a structured monument, the visitor would descend into cool, dark passages where the air was thick with the smell of earth and limestone. Then the torchlight would fall upon a wall of bones arranged in perfect rows, skulls staring outward in endless repetition. There was no chaos, only order, reflection of how death reclaims what life scatters. The bones seemed to whisper the same message that had echoed through centuries. Remember, you will become one of us. Even beyond Europe, the memento mori idea influenced how people related to death. It was a central part of Christian iconography, appearing not just in ossuaries, but in paintings, sculptures, and literature. Skulls were carved into tombstones and worn as rings by monks and scholars. These reminders were not tokens of despair, they were instruments of clarity. The constant awareness of death was thought to sharpen one's moral focus. To remember death was to remember truth. This mindset feels foreign to the modern world, where death has been sanitized, hidden away behind hospital curtains and euphemisms. But in confronting it so directly, medieval society found a strange kind of peace. The bone chapels forced people to see that the line between life and death was thin and porous. Those who came to pray among the dead did not leave in fear, they left in acceptance. The walls of bones were not meant to horrify, but to comfort, reminding visitors that death did not erase meaning, but restored it. Every ossuary, no matter how ornate or simple, carried the same message. All men are equal before the grave. The artist's hand that arranged the bones knew this truth intimately. It was not decoration, it was theology, philosophy, and realism carved from the remains of the faithful. Each skull was both a relic and a reflection, a teaching tool and a prayer. The art of the ossuary stands as one of history's most profound meditations on mortality. In a world defined by suffering, war, and faith, these spaces offered perspective, a silent sermon in calcium and dust. They reminded the living that death was not the enemy, but the inevitable companion of life, a truth that demanded reverence rather than fear. The memento mori was not an obsession with death, it was an invitation to live with awareness, to see life not as endless accumulation, but as brief stewardship. When the living walked through those bone-lined halls centuries ago, They were not entering a tomb, they were entering a classroom. The walls spoke the same lesson in every age, that the body decays. The world changes, but the soul, the meaning, the memory of existence continues. To forget that, in their eyes, was the true death. The ossuary, then, was not a monument to decay, was a reminder of eternity. In the heart of Rome, just steps away from the chaos of traffic and the bright spill of cafe lights, there's a doorway that leads somewhere entirely different. It doesn't open into a grand basilica or marble hall, but into something smaller, darker, and infinitely more intimate. Beneath the church of Santa Maria della Concezione dei Cappuccini lies one of the most unsettling yet strangely peaceful places in Europe, the Capuchin Crypt. Before we continue, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze. It helps us keep uncovering the world's forgotten spaces where history, art, and mortality meet in the quietest of ways. The Capuchin Crypt is not large. It consists of 6 small chapels, each lined, layered, and filled with bones. Around 4,000 Capuchin friars rest here, or rather, display themselves here. Their bones cover every surface, the ceilings, the walls, even the lamps. The arrangement is deliberate, not chaotic. Every femur, every skull, every vertebra serves a purpose. Nothing feels random. You can tell that the monks who built this space saw it as more than storage. It was a sermon written in calcium. The Capuchins were part of a branch of the Franciscan ordermen who believed in simplicity, poverty, and humility. To them, death was not something to fear. It was a natural passage, a mirror held up to the living. They didn't build monuments to deny it. They built monuments to accept it. The crypt became their meditation on what it meant to live well and die without illusion. As you step into the first chamber, the light dims. The air feels dry, ancient, and still. The first thing you notice is how quiet it is. Not the sterile silence of a museum, but a living quiet, the kind that carries weight. Bones are arranged into geometric patterns, arches of ribs, circles of skulls, columns of femurs, stacked like pillars. The sense of precision is remarkable. You can tell that this wasn't about fear, it was about reverence. The most famous of these spaces is called the Crypt of Skulls. Along its wall hangs a simple wooden plaque with a message written in Italian and Latin. What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. No sentence in Europe is more honest. No artwork delivers its meaning with such clarity. It doesn't moralize or threaten. It simply reminds you that death is not a punishment, it's a continuation. The message is unsettling because it's true. You read it and realize it's not speaking to someone in the past or future. It's speaking to you right now. You stand there breathing, surrounded by those who no longer can, and the line between life and death blurs. You understand that the bones aren't there to horrify you, they're there to equalize you. Kings, peasants, monks, tourists all become the same in time. The Capuchin monks who arranged these remains didn't do it out of morbid fascination. They were confronting impermanence. Every skull was once a brother. Every spine, every rib, every finger bone belonged to someone who prayed, who worked, who aged, and who died, believing that the body was only a vessel. When the friars used the bones to decorate the crypt, they weren't desecrating, they were preserving. They believed that the arrangement of bones into patterns was a way of turning mortality into devotion. Each of the 6 chapels has its own theme. One holds the remains of pelvises and vertebrae arranged in floral designs. Another is lined with skulls, each one resting in a niche like a relic. In the crypt of pelvises, the bones form arcs and rosettes that mimic the designs of classical architecture. It's as if the monks built a cathedral from themselves. In the crypt of the resurrection, a small painting of Jesus raising Lazarus hangs above an altar framed entirely by bones. Beneath it, skeletons of Capuchin friars in brown robes lie as if asleep, still wearing the habits they once prayed in. Time has turned their bodies into relics, but the posture remains humble. They lie as if waiting, not in terror, but in patience. The Capuchin crypt was created in the mid-17th century when the friars relocated to the New Scrooge and brought the remains of their deceased brothers with them. The earliest burials date back to 1528. Over the centuries, as new monks joined the order and older ones passed away, the bones were added, rearranged, and carefully incorporated into the structure. It wasn't decoration for its own sake, it was theology rendered in physical form. Standing there, you begin to realize how differently the monks saw death compared to how we see it today. Modern culture hides death, sanitizes it, treats it as a failure. But the Capuchins built their entire philosophy around it. They lived in its shadow and drew peace from it. The crypt isn't tragic, it's honest. It says, you will die, but that's not the end of the story. The artistry of the Capuchin crypt also reveals something profound about the human instinct to create meaning from decay. Bones, stripped of identity, become universal symbols. The friars didn't need marble or gold. They used themselves as the raw material for reflection. The geometry of the arrangements, the spirals, the symmetry, the order turns death into something structured and strangely beautiful. It's not an act of denial. It's a form of acceptance, so total that it becomes art. There's a moment that happens to everyone who visits. You move from shock to stillness. The first few minutes, your eyes dart from skull to skull, overwhelmed by the sheer number of them. Then, slowly, your mind adjusts. You start to see the design, the care, the intention. You stop seeing bones and start seeing messages. Every wall whispers the same truth: you will end. But your ending is not meaningless. Even the light in the crypt feels symbolic. It's dim, filtered through narrow openings that barely illuminate the pale forms. The bones catch the glow and seem to shimmer faintly, as if lit from within. You can see the texture, the porous surface, the fragile fractures, and you realize how temporary the human frame really is. Everything you think of as solid eventually becomes dust. But in this place, dust is arranged into order. The Capuchins didn't write treatises about mortality. They built one out of themselves. Their crypt is a manifesto made of bone. It doesn't just remind you of death, it reminds you to live without illusion. To them, death wasn't the opposite of life. It was the continuation of truth. The sign above the doorway tells you as much. What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. It's not a warning, it's an invitation to humility. Visitors often leave the crypt changed. Some feel uneasy. Others feel strangely peaceful, because somewhere between the horror and the reverence, you realize the point wasn't to shock you, it was to wake you up. To remind you that all the layers we build to protect ourselves, titles, wealth, appearance, will someday fall away. What remains will be what we made of our lives. The Capuchin crypt doesn't glorify death, it clarifies it. It tells you that decay can be beautiful, that time can be merciful, that the end isn't to be feared, but understood. And in that understanding, something ancient and comforting emerges. The knowledge that you are part of a cycle far older than yourself. In the silence of that underground chapel, surrounded by 4,000 monks who once prayed as you do now, the words on the plaque echo in your mind, quiet but absolute. What you are now, we once were. What we are now, you shall be. And that's how the Capuchins taught the living the one truth that no sermon ever could.